Good afternoon, everybody. Cal the Daddy here. We are back on the balcony for part 5 of the series of the murder of Bill J. Pumpernickel. Now, I just want to get one thing off before I start the video that, Saturday and Sunday, I made a pledge to post one video every weekend. However, since it is Memorial Day weekend, and I'm recording this on Monday, today is still technically the weekend. Okay? We good? Well, let's move on to Chapter 5 of the murder of Bill J. Pumpernickel. This is Chapter 5. You can run, but you can't hide. So, a bit of a recap. We left off on Chapter 4. This was in July of 1888. Police are notified that Paul Edgewood's buggy, 72316, had been dumped in some river in some desert, somewhere in the Dry Bones Valley. However, they could not locate it and the case went cold. And that's unfortunately how it sat. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and pretty soon almost an entire year had passed. However, some notable things happened during that time. In the spring of 1889, police got a surprising new resident returning to Rattlesnake County. That new resident was George Clint. So, in around mid-April of 1889, a recent census showed that George Clint, in fact, had come back to Rattlesnake County. Police thought that was odd. If you're convicted of killing the mayor of the city you're in, then why'd you come back to it? Police decided to follow Clint around just to see, what he was up to. It turned out he had moved to a completely different house. It was smaller and less noticeable, kind of right in the middle of the city. He had noticeably gotten rid of his telegraph machine. He had quit his job at the telegraph shop, and when the police were following him, they found him taking photos outside in the courtyard, sketching, or just kind of talking to himself and going to bars. Bystanders were very unsuspecting of this man because George Clint had in fact changed since then. He shaved his head and he had grown his beard out. He had also gotten rid of his glasses, which was a completely different look from the look he had the year prior. The thinning hairline with the pencil mustache, the Amish beard. He changed. However, when police were following him, he noticed that he didn't seem nervous. He wasn't doing, anything wrong. He was just kind of living his life like a normal guy. So, police decided to go a drastic route. They decide to let George Clint go. What if George Clint was just set up and never actually committed any of these crimes? What if he was just unlucky, to be kind of roped into this? So, in the early summer of 1889, George Clint goes free. And it stays that way until August 21st, 1889. Here's what happened that day. So, in the very, very south bank of the Edison River, two men in a canoe were fly fishing. These two men would come to the river every summer to fish, and it was a good fishing spot. The current wasn't too strong. The river flowed at about 20 miles an hour. It was perfect for fishing, upper level fishing. However, as they were nearing the end of their journey, this is, I would say, at around 4:30 p.m., their boat scraped something. And obviously the fishermen were very concerned. The river they were in was about 15 feet deep and, for their knowledge, didn't have any rocks. So what the men did is they moored their boat to the bank of the river and they decided to they decided to notify law enforcement that there was something in the river. So law enforcement got there at around 5 p.m. And what they did was they got several boats out to the scene where the men described of the obstruction in the river. They got ropes and horses, and slowly they pulled this heavy mass out of the river. Before it even broke the surface of the water, the officers could already tell. They could see wheels. Wheels, that's odd. Maybe someone lost their wagon or something like that. So the horses kept on pushing and pulling until finally the mass was out of the water. And this did not look good. It was heavily rusted. It was banged up on one side, and it was soaking wet and leaking and just in terrible shape. However, the officers knew one thing. It was a buggy. And not any type of buggy, but as they swiped away the moss and grime from the buggy, they could tell the familiar logo of Harrison. This was a Harrison buggy found in the river. Now let me remind you that not only did Paul Edgewood rent a Edison buggy, George Clint was seen in that same buggy. Just to make sure, police checked the identification number on the tires. Well, I'll be damned, one of them says. What is it? 72316. After more than a year of searching, the buggy had been found, and the case was back on. Jack Robinson and Tom Richards were called that very same day to see the news, and they were obviously ecstatic, as you might think. Now, they had their killer's buggy, which meant that George Clint was no longer a free man anymore. He was now running from the law once again. So, the mangled buggy was hauled up onto a trailer and taken to a repair shop where the detectives analyzed it. And this is around 11 p.m. So they opened what was left of the trunk, which was basically just a cabinet on the back of the vehicle, and they found several soaked but still legible papers. It was kind of like registration, the vehicle, and they could not believe their eyes when they were able to make out the words P. Edgewood on one of the identification packets. Police kind of put their hands up like this. Oh my gosh. Have we found their vehicle? Have we found their vehicle after all this time? Robinson and Richards looked at each other and they said, "Oh yeah. Oh yeah, we did." Not only was this buggy permanently linked to Paul Edgewood, there were also several pamphlets in the trunk that stated his address. So on August 23rd, 1889, police went to Paul Edgewood's house. It was an unsuspecting house in the calmer section of Rattlesnake County. It wasn't a big house. It was made of wood, 2 stories. Police banged on the door, demanding there be an answer. However, after getting no answer, they decided to break down the door and storm the house. The house was completely silent, the curtains were drawn, and it looked like it hadn't been lived in a couple months. The police knew that this was Paul Edgewood's house due to several portraits and photographs of him similar to descriptions. Police went up a flight of stairs to Paul Edgewood's bedroom in a narrow hallway. They found a briefcase on the bed, on the unmade bed, and I must say that this room was pretty dirty. Looked like it hadn't been lived in, obviously in a couple months. I already said that, but whatever. But there was paper strewn around, there were photographs strewn around. However, it seemed that Mr. Edgewood left in a haste. However, it seemed like he forgot one thing. In this briefcase, which police later confiscated, they opened it up and they found blueprints of Bill J. Pumpernickel's house, photos of the entrance of Bill J. Pumpernickel's house taken by George Clint as he was building it, photos of Nathan Andreasen and Paul Edgewood, and then photos of the gun that police thought was the murder weapon. It was a little revolver. like the thing that cowboys use. I'm not a gun guy, so I'm sorry I can't, but police knew that this gun was the murder weapon due to the analysis of the bullets left on Bill J. Pumpernickel's body, and analysis in the 1880s was basically just looking at it and saying like, yep, that came from a pistol or whatever. Once again, not a gun guy. So Nathan Andreessen's identity is confirmed with photographic evidence of all three men. 3 days after the Edgewood house raid, the first wanted posters went up for George Clint, Nathan Andreessen, and Paul Edgewood. And later that night, police remembered close to midnight, a telegram was intercepted, this time from a completely new number. People knew that it was George Clint because he said, "Hey Paul, it's George." This is what the telegram said. "Hey Paul, it's George. Listen, I'm tired of running from the law. I can't live like this. We need to confess. I don't care if I get sentenced to life. I can't have this anymore. I can't have this on my conscience." Paul Edgewood retorted back, "Are you out of your goddamn mind? We can't do that. We gotta escape to Nevada or Utah." And then the telegraph line went silent. The next day, August 27th, 1889, police did kind of a preliminary search for George Clint around the bar that he used to hang out. And police knew that he used to hang out around at this bar from 2 to 4 because obviously they were following him. George Clint did not show up. Later that day, police knocked on his door, and after hearing no answer, they went home dissatisfied, saying that Clint had probably skipped town once again, and they were going to organize a search party immediately. However, in the wee hours of August 28th, 1889, George Clint's 53-year-old mom, Ava, burst into the control room of the officers, frantically stating that her son George, she had not heard from her son George since yesterday morning. According to Mrs. Clint, George apparently took his horse, packed a couple bags, and after hugging her said, quote unquote, he's gonna go away for a while. When police asked Mrs. Clint, obviously, where's your son heading off to? "Oh, he said he's going to the Highland Desert." So the Highland Desert was a trek about 25 miles up from north of Rattlesnake County. It's what Palm Springs looks like, right? Picture that, but like 20 degrees colder and like more rocky and mountainous. Basically what the Highland Desert of Rattlesnake County looked like. So in early September of 1889, police set off on a couple days' journey to possibly locate George Clint. According to Ava Clint's testimony, he said he brought stuff to pitch a tent to, stuff to light a fire to, and interestingly, a bottle of moonshine, a notepad with a pen, his camera, and a handgun. He also got his horse, obviously, I think I already said that. I don't think so. Whatever. So, in early September, police obviously went out to search the Highland Desert for George Clint. And this journey proved difficult. There had been high winds for the last couple of days, and any footprints had been covered up by the wind. However, on September 4th, 1889, police found a lead. You see, as they were nearing the center of Highland Desert, this is around 8 in the morning, around a little gully, police noticed a foul stench. Police looked down and saw the remains of a horse down in the gully. Police were like, "Oh, this is odd. Who just left their horse down here?" On closer inspection, it turns out that one of the horse's legs, my notes almost blew away, that one of the horse's legs was broken, and it had been shot in the head once. Police almost immediately knew that this was George Clint's horse. But how could he continue on foot? One of the detectives asked. Well, I don't think he continued for much longer. We gotta find this guy, even if he's dead or alive. We gotta find this guy. The search picked up the next morning, September 5th, and at around 8 p.m., the detectives were heading up this little trail around this kind of like this rocky, not mountain, but kind of hill about 200 feet tall. Police noticed around halfway up a shattered moonshine bottle. Police picked it up and said, "We're close. George, we're coming for you, buddy." And then they ran up the rest of the hill. One of the officers got ahead of the rest of the group, and they found him on the top of like this little plateau. Think of like, it's not a cave, but there's one wall of rocks right here, kind of rocks scattered around, and then the rest of the hill going down. And this is what this officer was looking at. And they asked him, "Sir, what's wrong?" And the detective looked around and said, "You might want to see this." Police rounded the corner, and there, slumped up on the rocks with a drying pool of blood around his head, was the body of George Clint. On closer inspection, it had been determined that he had shot himself in the head with his pistol and that had killed him instantly. And they also said he had gotten blackout drunk from the moonshine he had drank. About 2 feet away from his body lay a brown satchel. Inside that satchel was his camera, photographs of himself, Nathan Andreasen, Paul Edgewood, and Bill J. Pumpernickel, and what they later determined to be a suicide note dated August 26th, 1889, the day of his fabled conversation with Paul Edgewood. Based on the condition of his body, it looked like he had been laying there for about a week, which closely lines up to when he went missing. So he probably accidentally rode his horse into the... So what detectives probably thought is, on the day of his conversation, he realized that, obviously George Clint had paranoid schizophrenia, and police assumed that he had gotten a panic attack and decided the only way out was to kill himself. So what they assumed was Clint wrote his suicide note, packed up his bags, told his mom that he's going away, rode his horse up to the highland looking for a good place to kill himself, accidentally rode his horse into a gully, continued the rest of the way on foot, found where he was going to do it, positioned everything perfectly, put the gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. Police didn't know whether to feel happy, sad, or angry. They obviously felt happy that George Clint was not around to hurt anybody or conspire against anyone ever again. They were sad that this young man's life had to end like this. After all, George Clint was only 32 years old. And they were angry because they would not be able to bring Clint to justice if he were to be found guilty with involvement. However, police did hold a couple moments of silence for this tragic story. So later that day, they brought in a ambulance, kind of like a trailer or something. They loaded Clint's body in a couple of sacks, loaded it onto the trailer, and took it back to Rattlesnake County for an autopsy. That same night, police were reviewing the suicide note and determined that it had 2 pages. The first page was, simply stating why he was going to kill himself and why he couldn't, live life as a bandit on the run anymore. However, flipping over to the second side of the page found something interesting. George Clint basically confessed for Nathan Andreasen and Paul Edgewood. In this letter, it read, "I feel the most guilty for being involved in the murder of our mayor, William Jeremiah Pumpernickel. I feel extremely guilty about this, and I feel like the only way to go about this is to end my life." However, a couple stanzas below that, they said, Mr. Andresen and Mr. Edgewood are in Nevada. I have no idea where in Nevada they are, but they're not that far into Nevada. Some of their last conversations with me have stated that they're somewhere in kind of southern western Nevada. Unfortunately, that's all I could help you guys out with, and that's literally what the note said. He gave the most up-to-date descriptions of Paul Edgewood and Nathan Andresen. He said the last time he saw Nathan in early 1889, he had longer hair down to his shoulders, and he had grown out his mustache a bit. And Paul Edgewood had basically stayed the same, except he had grown out kind of like a scruff, a 5 o'clock shadow. On September 9th, 1889, George Clint's body, per his family's wishes, was cremated and given to his family for burial. George Clint today, his urn was sealed in a mausoleum, and he was buried in a simple grave with a simple tombstone. And that basically does it for George Clint. So now, officers had Nathan Andresen and Paul Edgewood's location. Then all they had to do was track these guys down and bring them to justice. That does it for Chapter 5 of The Murder of Bill J. Pumpernickel. Stay tuned for next weekend for Chapter 6. Calvadaddy, out.